Now it's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Jacqueline Kerr, who is an affiliate at the Center of International Security and Cooperation at Stanford University. Dr. Kerr holds a PhD in government and from Georgetown and MA in Russian, East European and Eurasian studies. She had held previous fellowship in Harvard and had done field research in Russia, Kazakhstan, and Qatar. Also relevant that Dr. Kerr has experience as a software engineer, and her current research focuses on cybersecurity and the internet policies of non-democratic regimes. Dr. Kerr, please.
Thank you so much, Thor. It's a pleasure to be here. It's my first time in Israel, actually, so it's fascinating. So let me see. I have slides here. I think I can queue up. Okay, great. Thanks. So I was asked to give a talk sort of as an introduction to the session. And so as such, I thought I would draw on two themes from my own research on cybersecurity and on the evolution of authoritarian internet controls. So the framing of my talk is around the challenge posed to democratic internet governance and the tradition of a free and global World Wide Web by information warfare. I got into this by studying the evolution of authoritarian internet controls, especially focusing on countries which were avoiding the sort of great firewall, draconian censorship approach. And what you saw in the late 2000s and early 2010s was a lot of countries that were, especially authoritarian countries, experiencing new sorts of mass protest events that were utilizing the affordances of the new technology, even in spite of having very controlled media systems, less than free civil society, and having challenges in this kind of mobilization. The new technology's affordances allowed a different sort of activism and mobilization that could take place very quickly and could galvanize large populations. Like, for example, in the Green protest movement in Iran in 2009, or the Arab Spring events for 2010, 2011, and in Russia in the White Ribbon protest movement, which you see here, which was the largest mass protest that had occurred since the collapse of the Soviet Union. And during this period, there was a lot of utopian talk. At Stanford, my alma mater, there was a center founded called the Center for the Study of Liberation Technologies. This idea that these were technologies that could bring no harm and all good. And it was all part of this ideal of a global internet universalism. The World Wide Web, internet content, these were freedoms which were being quickly linked to freedoms of basic human rights, democratic norms of free expression, and the ideal of a global public sphere. And thought about in terms of how to govern, usually the Western countries supported a multi-stakeholder approach, and an ideal where the internet, the World Wide Web would be more or less the same anywhere you went. At the same time, you had developing concerns about cybersecurity as a national security issue, the development of military and intelligence capabilities, growing numbers of attacks and actors, and yet that was framed more in terms of attacks on networks and computer systems, possibility of crossover to kinetic attacks, all about technical systems, and not so much about internet content or media or the public sphere. Interestingly, if you fast forward to 2016 and onward, the discourse has changed dramatically. Now, social media platforms that were part of the hero of the previous story are seen as a vector of national security concern, of attack. Often in public discourse and news coverage about this, everything is framed as a cyber attack, even when what you're really talking about is media coverage and things of this sort, and social media platforms. So what happened, or what are the repercussions of this for that earlier ideal, and for maybe a more sober version of that ideal if we want to hold on to some piece of that? In the remainder of my talk, I'll go through what's new about this, because information warfare is not new. Information warfare has been around through the ages. But the sort of information warfare we're seeing, the utilization of the affordances of the new technologies does make it somewhat different. And how do we deal with what's different about that? How do we think about it? How do we conceptualize it? I'll discuss a little bit about Russia as an exemplar. I think I have about 10 too many slides there, so I'll probably skip through them and invite you to ask questions later. And then about the vulnerabilities, potentially, of democratic systems to this sort of new form of aggression, and how we can think about possible responses, to which I can't say I have all the solutions, but cue it up for discussion. So to start out, cyber-enabled information warfare, or as a colleague and I have referred to it, cyber-enabled information and influence campaigns. What's new about this? We're used to talking about the CIA framework, about confidentiality, integrity, and access to data on machines. We're used to talking about exploiting vulnerabilities of technology, breaking into systems. And yet here we find ourselves talking about using systems as they were meant to be used, using them in ways that don't violate them, their technical, the way they were built to be used. Instead, you're using social media platforms as social media platforms. But you're going after the vulnerabilities in society, the vulnerabilities in people. And that's one of the things that's different about targeting internet content and using it as part of a systematic approach. Of course, you can combine this with the other, and that's what you often see. You see exploitation of networks and accounts, phishing attacks to get at data, and then using that data, like emails, as compromat or as leaks to shape public opinion, and using the viral spread of that information. So it mixes the conceptualizations that were distinct in the former way of thinking about this in Western democracies. And as you see this set of techniques developing, you see it's not just a tool of wartime. In fact, it's often, and maybe more often, used not during war or during gray zone types of hybrid activity. It targets the perception and reasoning and emotions of an adversary or whoever the target is. It targets things like cognitive biases, the idea that people like to think intuitively about things. They favor simplicity and things they hear repeated a lot, things that play to their confirmation bias, their existing beliefs, and also to emotions. And if you can play with people's emotions by the content you show them, that can have a significant effect. And you can, in this way, affect the narrative, the framing, the agenda of what is being discussed in a society. You can manipulate these sorts of vulnerabilities to affect reasoning and decision-making processes. And in so doing, that can be part of a broader strategy. You can create doubt that leads to delay. And meanwhile, the facts on the ground have changed, a fait accompli. Playing with ambiguity, with plausible deniability. And this can be used to defeat more powerful opponents. Furthermore, it can be used not just internationally, it can be used at different levels and in different theaters. It can be used domestically, regionally, internationally. It can be used against individuals, against opposition groups, dissidents, against movements, coalitions, against other states. So if you look at the Russian example, you see examples of all of this. Arguably, the strategic approach comes out of several sources. There's a long history of thinking about information, both domestically in terms of national security and stability, and in terms of military strategic thought. Domestically, this is one of the places you see the intersection with the study of authoritarian regimes and their politics. In the West, in the late 2000s, early 2010s, we were still stuck in the paradigm of the Cold War thinking of authoritarian regimes being hermetically sealed, that they relied on complete control over information, and that if you poked a hole in that, the balloon would go flying around the room. You'd cause an information cascade, people would understand each other's hidden preferences against the regime, people would come out a la 1989 into the streets, you'd have mass protests, and hallelujah, you have democracy. But actually, authoritarian regimes have moved on from that with globalization. And even the most closed authoritarian regimes, with a few exceptions, maybe Turkmenistan and North Korea, for example, even states like China that we think of as closed regimes have moved on from this way of thinking and have realized that they have to do a mix of methods in control of information. It's not just about blocking everything. It's also about how you control the narrative. And in some cases, like Russia, until the mass protests for sure, and to some extent still today, they have relied much more heavily on a strategy of content production and manipulation than on blocking content and information. And what's beneficial about this is it's what's called low-intensity coercion. It fits well in a hybrid regime context in which some of the regime's legitimacy is coming not from having guns at people's backs, but from actually winning people over, having them think the regime is legitimate, that it's using democracy and elections, and that people have freedoms. And if you do things that are too overt and obvious, then people lose that perception. But if you do things like use of laws that are carefully written to get at particular types of activity that are most disturbing to the regime's stability, on the other hand, or like use of very low levels of censorship that are all legally justified, while you're also planting information through bots, through trolls, through paid bloggers and the like, you can have a huge effect on discrediting certain opposition figures and at the same time changing the narrative without a feeling of a draconian crackdown. Now, in terms of conceptualization, Russia is an exemplar of how they've thought about this. Starting in 2000, after the Kursk disaster, where a submarine sunk and everyone on board died, and it made Putin look very bad in the news media, shortly afterwards was issued the first doctrine of information security, which was framed in a way which aligned the notion of political stability and national security. And there was a new version of this doctrine updated in 2016, which explicitly took account of the internet and internet content. Meanwhile, in terms of military thought in Russia, you have the development of how to use these new technologies and their affordances as well. There's a long history of thinking about information in military strategy and doctrine in Russia and the Soviet Union. Ideas like reflexive control coming out of cybernetics theory about controlling the thinking processes. Maskirovka, to try to have some sort of charade a la Potomkin villages and the like to change people's perceptions, to give misperception, misguidance. And following the collapse of the Soviet Union, there were definitely those who thought of perestroika and the flow of information that played a role in unstabilizing the regime as something that they needed to avoid in the future. But particularly following the color revolutions in the 2000s in former Soviet satellites and former Soviet republics, and the Arab Spring, you have a realization of this as being much more of an immediate threat. And some often quoted these days is a 2013 speech by General Valery Gerasimov, where he talked explicitly about, let's take the Arab Spring and think of it, usually we wouldn't think of that as military, but let's think of that as a military threat. If it is a military threat, what sort of threat is that? To us, what sort of threat is that? And he talked about information spaces of a society and the cognitive and psychological influence and how to turn this around and protect against it and use similar strategies in their own military strategy. And how to, in so doing, compel the actions, change the decision-making processes of stronger opponents, and overcome them without ever having to go to war. You see this in several theaters in Russia. You see this domestically, regionally, and internationally. This is the part where I'll jump through slides because I put too much, but a few good examples. You see this woman crying vociferously in the corner on state TV and explaining how she watched a 3-year-old child in eastern Ukraine crucified and his mother made to watch. And this was an actress who then showed up in a different town square with a different name in a newscast a few days later, and so this was widely called out. But there are plenty of examples where it doesn't get widely called out. Things that are outright propaganda, but it's often relying on mixing lies and truth, on making it unclear whether something is satire or is for real support, and the like. And use of techniques of disruption, confusion, deniability in combination with that kind of propaganda on all different platforms. So that was state TV, but you have all this stuff going on social media at the same time. And there's a convergence between these and a unified strategy. The use of information and leaks. Famous example where Boris Nemtsov's phone calls before he was assassinated were cut and pasted and displayed online to try to undermine his credibility in a way which made him look like he was backstabbing friends. An example of compromat. How many of you know what the picture in the upper right-hand corner is? Anyone? The girls dancing? Yes. Does anyone know what the picture next to it is?
Rally against Pussy Riot.
Not a rally against Pussy Riot. It's Za Vashu i Nashu Svobodu. It's a rally for yours and our freedom in support of or against war with Ukraine. That happened around the same time that the media in the West was covering Pussy Riot ad nauseum. There was very little coverage of this event. 50,000 people marching in Moscow. I took this picture. And what's interesting about that is they know how to amplify back the things, their very explicit choice of Pussy Riot to be the poster children for Russian oppression of the opposition. Because they expressed something that wasn't very popular with the opposition, insofar as the opposition was mostly about electoral fraud and democratic freedoms of that sort. These girls were more in support of feminist rights and against the role of the church with the state and things like this that were more avant-garde values, let's say. So that's a use of amplifying this back through the international media system. Regional conflicts, you have some very stellar uses of framing as well. For example, in the lower right-hand corner, this is a poster from Crimea from the spring of 2014 showing that on the 16th of March, you'll choose, and it's a choice between the Crimea with a swastika on it or the Crimea with the Russian flag on it. And very effective use of the history of the World War II and Nazism as the enemy. In the media about this that was used both domestically and in the region of the conflict. And there'll be a lot of discussion of this today, the examples from Western Europe and the US, so I won't dwell on it. But just a little bit of a point of hope here, maybe. The shirt in the lower right-hand corner is from one of the Black Lives Matters sites that was created by Russian propagandists. And it is an example of how there's a little bit of tone deafness too sometimes. It says Black Xmas only with a gun in a stocking. It's sort of an example of a pro-Black Lives Matter t-shirt made up by a racist. But nonetheless, there's these same techniques being used in what's being done in other societies internationally. Now, so what? Are democracies vulnerable to this? How is it being used? It's being used at least to try to influence the domestic politics of other states and also to try to influence the international system. For irredentist purposes, revisionist purposes, aggression, fait accompli types of accomplishments. And so why are democracies vulnerable to this, or are they? Or why is the international system based in rule of law vulnerable? Well, it's vulnerable because we care a lot about law and rules and clear distinctions and institutions. So it really matters who won the election. It really matters if it was an act of war that can be shown to be or not. So if it's sort of unclear and murky, that sort of confusion can make a big difference. It also can play a role in delegitimizing institutions that are key to that are essential to democratic legitimacy. And so in these ways, democracies are somewhat vulnerable, also because of our values, because of caring about freedom of expression and rule of law. Well, so are there possible solutions to this? And this is the part where I pass the baton mostly to the next speakers, but you hear a lot of discussion of some things which may or may not work very well, like in the security community, you hear a lot of discussion of deterrence by punishment. Well, what are you going to do? Do this back to them? Doesn't that violate our values? Especially if you're doing it on this sort of societal-wide effect. Deterrence by denial. Well, how do you strengthen resilience and protect yourself enough from this? You're talking about average people reading media and whether they're more or less aware of the possibility of it being fake, for example. There's a lot of discussion of regulation of social media platforms, but when does that cross the line into censorship? A couple of things I'll end with as sort of key takeaways I think are important. One is that as we think about our values and how to maintain those, we need to remember values are always in relationships to each other and balanced. And there's always a trade-off. When John Stuart Mill wrote about freedom of expression and that the marketplace of ideas, you had good ideas would rise to the top, and so it was better for the society overall to allow more ideas to be explained, even unpopular ones. Well, he also talked about the harm principle. And that was in balance with the freedoms. The harm principle was that allow individual liberty up to, but not past the point where it does harm to others. Now, I'm not advocating one way or another on this, but I think that going back to those causal bases of our normative positions is important in thinking about this. Like, for example, is it different? Are the affordances of the technology so different that they affect his causal argument there? That, now you can galvanize thousands of supporters around a fringe idea to go march on principles of racism and bigotry in a small town like Charlottesville in Virginia. I don't know, but it's different. And you have to rethink those fundamental bases. Last 2 points. How can we do this in a way that doesn't have too much of a democracy deficit? And how can we do it in a way that avoids losing all of the sort of global idealism that pervaded the early World Wide Web? There's been a lot of ad hoc in-house solutions, changing algorithms on platforms and things like this. A lot of legal solutions with regard to regulation. And we need these technical communities, the legal experts, the technical experts. But how can we do this in a way that takes account of the perspectives and interests of other stakeholders as well and avoids over-securitization of our public sphere? I'll leave. And two last points. What's really important for both of these is clarity about our conceptualization. That we're not just mirror imaging the information security approach that I talked about before. And attention to process. And how do we make the process more democratic in thinking about these things? Thank you.